Welcome back to the History Roundtable Podcast. In this episode, this is Barris and I continued our conversation from episode 1, and we decided that it was so interesting we thought we would keep recording and make it available to you guys. So I hope you enjoy and take a listen.
Or bad, but I can see also how that's daunting to the average person, and that's bad because you just don't reach out to those who need to learn to know that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It just ends up being a sort of circle jerk, and I think that's a bad thing.
It is, and honestly, people in academia, you're writing a journal to be peer reviewed by other journals, and who in the public is actually gonna read that? What they're gonna do, like you say, they're gonna watch The Patriot. I read a really
Exactly.
cool book recently that actually argued that Americans were way more into King George III than we thought. And it looked at some cool bottom up stuff. It looked like pictures of royalty in bars and like on postcards and mob actions and what effigies they chose to burn or revere. And it was a really cool bottom up study. But I'm thinking to myself, like, what American is going to read that? They're going to watch The Patriot and go, no, we hated the king. Because look.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I think one of the worst part about the Patriots, other than depicting the English as the most evil people in the world, um, is the fact that it makes it seem like every American was on board, or like every states were together. When in fact, I think, um, like I don't, it's really rusty, but I think at first there were a lot of friction between the states, and a lot of states wanted to do their own thing, and mostly there were a lot of loyalists, there were a lot of royalists. Same thing in France, and it just I think a lot of yeah, it was starting again. But like in France, it's I think a lot big huge idea of um like, oh, everyone was on board about the republic. It's just everyone wanted to do it and things like that. But that's and those who didn't want to were the nobles. It's not so much that like everyone knows that. I think in the US it would be the same thing as like those who didn't want to leave England were those who gained something financial from being a and the nobles and the clergy. Everyone wanted a republic, but actually, if you look at it, there's a strong belief, for example, that the reason why there's the white part of our flag is the white of the monarchy, and that's when France, because that's the French flag was made when France wanted a constitutional monarchy, which was the what people wanted at first. Now it shifted quickly from there, but to basically say word and that it was a universal decision is wrong, and it just ignores a lot of history. But I feel like it's the common belief.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's easy to do that sort of looking back because, well, France is a republic now. So there were people who wanted to get to where it is today, and there were those regressive holdouts. And
Yeah.
and like you say, yeah, even John Adams put the estimate at like a third of Americans were loyalists, a third were patriots, and a third didn't care. We've kind of tweaked those numbers. It's more like 40-35 and stuff, but he wasn't super far off. I actually read a really interesting history of the American Revolution that calls it American Revolutions, and Alan Taylor makes this argument: was it the first American Civil War? Because he can look in a ton of American towns, and there are two different groups of Americans with different opinions on how the government should be run, fighting and killing each other. Is that not a civil war? And it's an
Yeah.
interesting point.
First, I love the indifference part. I think indifferent people are largely underrepresented in history. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even though I strongly believe they're actually the majority, I think most people just want to they just want to be able to raise their crops and not be killed and butchered, and didn't really care about how that was done. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really For example, with a lot of the during World War II, when France was occupied, a lot of the like those who were trying to sabotage the Germans, for example.
Oh, the French Resistance.
Yeah, and I think we like to bundle them together as some kind of united group that just wanted one thing, which was France to be free. But again, it was a lot of different groups. There was a lot of people with different goals. There were some that were Marxists. There were some who, I, there some were Republican. And they were infighting with each other. Actually, doing a lot of infighting between each other. But we, in the end, we kind of like to just la résistance. But there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that one single, at least until the end when they were more organized. There wasn't that one single group that just wanted to get rid of the Germans. They all had their own um, agendas. They all had their own desires. And the problem is that, it's always problematic to say that, especially as a Frenchman, because it kind of ruins the how do you say it? National Roman, the national book, le roman national. Like how
Mm.
this sort of story that we've created about France and the French, and every country has that thing. And whenever you kind of go against that, uh, or you're always gonna get a lot of hatred.
Hmm. Yeah, with the U.S., it's the same thing because we so have this mythology tied into the idea of republicanism and market economics, and so obviously the Patriots represent that, but Taylor has a lot of documentation that shows that oftentimes the way people in a town went was whatever army occupied it. And he has tons of examples from like Pennsylvania and New York where like people were patriots or they were loyalists based on whoever had guns and whoever was there and whoever would keep the
Yeah,
services flowing. Like they were going to suck up to whoever, like you say, who made sure that they were able to get to their crops and have water and be able to trade as best they could and things like that.
yeah. I think it's just, again, indifference is underrepresented, and I think we just promote these ideas and people with these great ideas, full of idealism and things like that. But in the end, the people in France revolted too high, or the bourgeois. Actually, it's the bourgeois who started the French Revolution. There's also this sort of image of peasant revolution, but it was actually the bourgeois, and because they were going to get taxed again, and they were sick of it. And it's not history is not that idealist. How do, I'll say, but that much full of idealism. I feel a lot of
Mm-hmm.
time is just people being pragmatic and doing whatever was best in the situation. And then in the end, it was just being able to raise your crops without being killed too much.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. But
It's like, sorry.
oh no, continue.
It's like, the 100-Year War. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of people like to try to depict it as England against France. And it's actually something I really want to look into in my channel. If you look at it, it was really more the French royal family fighting the English royal family, which were both two different branches of the same dynasty. But the farmer in the end didn't really care. He couldn't care less who the king was going to be in the end. It really wouldn't have been that different. And it's just funny how the national identity, we like to try to depict it as the Great War of France against England, and how Jeanne d'Arc defended France,
Mm-hmm.
and not the holdings of the French king.
Well, that's in the British. They mythologize Agincourt and same thing. But
Yeah.
for a regular French farmer, if you would have asked them, hey, is this all worth it? to not have an English king from the same branch of the same dynasty, they'd probably say, no,
Yeah,
like, get out of my field.
exactly. And it's just, and in the end, it wasn't even having an English king. It was the same. It was literally the same. It's just
It was the, if
like
I'm
for
talking on my
it's like
ass, the
how
Plantagenet family. Weren't they both branches of the Plantagenets? I
it
could be.
was, yeah,
Okay.
Les Plantagenets, and they changed all the time. Like I think in France it was Capet, and in England it was but that's just junior branches. But if you
Mm-hmm.
look back, in the end, they were all related, and it was basically just brother cousins fighting for a throne. And so it's not. It was more of a family dispute than than two nations depicting itself. I mean, I also think just the idea of a nation back then was kind of irrelevant. It was more the holdings of a certain king or a certain lord. But we try to. It's just so much more convenient to imagine the way we see our country today. They saw it in the same way back then, basically. Like this
Mm-hmm.
is France, and we want it.
But like you mentioned, like that's that anachronism that people today backport those beliefs on people back then. Kind of, you're right with the American Revolution and with leading up to the American Revolution. A lot of those states couldn't care less if another state had issues. I mean, look at even after the Revolution, where you have, oh crap, not the Whiskey Rebellion, the other one. Oh, this is gonna drive me nuts. Shays Rebellion. And Massachusetts literally is like having unrest issues, but because of how the Articles of Confederation were set up, other states didn't have to send troops, and they didn't.
Mhm.
But nowadays we can say, oh yeah, they're all the same thing. That's all America. They all fought together in this revolution. Like, no, a bunch of militias were fighting often for their own states and their own interests. And that I learned this in Taylor's book, but there were people in Kentucky or the Kentucky Territory at the time who wanted to just be part of Spain. They got tired of a lot of the nonsense, and some of them sent out feelers to just annex themselves to Spain because they thought that would be in their state's
Wow.
best interest. And
Yeah.
because yeah, like the British government and later even the U.S. government at times tried to curtail settlers going into Native American lands and messing with them. So they thought maybe Spain would let,
Mhm.
but it's just nuts. And like, during the Civil War, a lot of it's North versus South, but I'll try to find a link. But at one point, like North Carolina and Georgia, one of them had a shortage of uniforms, the other one had a surplus, and they wouldn't share. And it's like you're in the middle of this giant civil war, you're trying to become independent from the United States, and you guys are going to go like that. But it's always more complicated.
I mean, I remember reading that I think there was huge issues in funding, for example, the Revolutionary Army
Mm-hmm.
during the American Revolution, just because the states didn't want to pay their share.
No, and under the Articles of Confederation, they didn't have to.
Yeah. And and I think it sort of baffles American today because they're much more united as a country. But back then, it was a ton of small countries. Well, each state wanted to have
Mm-hmm.
their own little independent thing. Um, yeah, and I think it's, yeah, again, projecting the present to the past, but it's also the whole creation of a national novel, and this is how it was, and manifest destiny and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and and it's the same thing in France. I think it's the same thing in every country, but it's always shocking, to be honest, after you've been told all that, to kind of discover that it's not necessarily true, that it's just much more ambiguous than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's weird how nationalist to, rather, mythologies kind of come about, and they look at events from the past and they appropriate them, even though, like you say, a lot of the people back then would not have thought, oh, I'm doing this because one day France will be great. Like, no, you're doing
Yeah,
this because a royal family's having a spat.
exactly. Exactly. And it's just, yeah, I just, it's like the whole reason why, oh, French are goals, basically, even though, um, you know, France is the descendant of the Gauls, but even though there was no such thing as Gaul, it was just a bunch of Celtic tribes that happened to be in the same geographical location as France. Um, but I think first of all, I think it sort of paints France's history, like France as we know it today, as being much older than it really is,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just it gives you legitimacy. It gives you like, yeah, I don't know how to say, but it's just
Well, yeah, you
so,
use that to get legitimacy today. Like,
yeah,
let's
yeah,
unite as Frenchmen and act as the French, because look at this great history we share, in giant quotation marks, share, because as your video shows, like, no.
yeah, no, exactly. And I think a lot of it was that's why I'm planning on doing a video on this. But the reason why the whole Gallic identity was risen was following the Prussian-French War. You know, basically the politicians all started promoting this idea because yeah, they needed something to unite France, and they had to find this common identity, and the common identity was the fact that they were all Gauls. And it's just and it's pretty interesting. I think yeah, a lot of time is just to unite people. I think for example in Europe, a long time the common identity was the fact that they had the same religion,
Mm-hmm.
and that helped them unite against, for example, the Ottomans, or against, for example, the yeah, just I can't remember the name of the Caliphate in Spain, for example.
Oh, the
It's
Battle of
always
Tours and the. Oh, I don't want to pronounce. Was
I
it
think,
the Umayyad? No, they didn't go all that
yeah,
far, did
but I
they?
think it changed over time.
Yeah.
I can't remember, to be honest.
Oh, I
I'm
mean,
going to
there were
embarrass
Umayyads,
myself, but I just know that
Abbasids. There were a
yeah,
lot.
actually going to say I just remember that we beat them at the Battle of Tours.
Yes.
It's like as we
Mm-hmm.
even though, can you even say it was France back then? No, I don't think so. It was just I mean, even the king didn't kill. I don't think the king called himself king of France. It was like king of the Franks.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, I think it's pretty interesting, but I also think it's important to sort of realize what is truth and what is just mythology.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was, yeah. Speaking of France and French identity, it was fascinating. A couple years ago, my wife and I we went hiking, and I'm sorry for all the things I'm about to do to the wonderful French language. We did the Tour du Mont Blanc, and going through
Yeah,
going through Savoy. And the reason I know
yeah,
Savoy is the Savoyard flag is there, and like all the dishes, it has Savoyard plastered on everything. And
yeah,
it's amazing
yeah.
because Savoy's now split up in like Italy, France, and Switzerland. But you go to these little mountain towns, they are not Italian or French or Swiss. They are still Savoyard. Like, it was really interesting to see that.
Yeah. I actually love about France is just so culturally diverse. I think in every region there's different food, different language, different history, just because it used to be a different country in all of these places, and actually I think there's a resurgence now of a local identity. Like in any public meeting, you would see a flag from Brittany, for example. That's
Mm-hmm.
a common joke in France. It's like, there will be a French flag and a Britain flag. um, but like for example, I actually came back to my hometown, and I realized one of our local village, they replaced all the billboards with the local Occitan language, and so it's kind of a there was a lot of actually 19th century, there was an active repression by Paris, the Parisian government, to sort of kind of um, regionalism and just unify France more. And it just shows how much the fact that they needed to do that. It shows how diverse and how ununified France was.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of I think a lot of France is actually Paris, but France is not Paris.
But that was a lot of Paris's doing, like you say. I think it was Gerald Siegel or Seigel. I'm gonna have to look at the spelling. He did an interesting book comparing the Industrial Revolution and the bourgeois of Britain, France, and Germany. And for France, we talked about the roads in Paris, but also the railroads and the national road network. Paris very deliberately created, instead of like the major cities linking to each other, it was a web going straight to Paris. And like France was really
I'm sure it
unique
was.
that they were trying to connect all the outside regions to them and have Paris be the hub. Whereas Germany and Britain really didn't have like, well, I mean, Germany at the time, Berlin wouldn't have even been in the center, but like London didn't do the same thing where they had this like web and spoke. The British cities were much more interconnected, where France, they weren't as interconnected as straight to Paris. And I found that super fascinating.
Yeah, no, there was always a Parisian centrist. I mean, I think there was the active policy in the 19th century in France was to basically kill the regional languages in school. Like you can look it online, you would see these pictures, you know, um, showing school posters, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's like, or in the south of France, a lot of the Occitan language, and actually, following that, there was a huge drop, and a lot of grandparents didn't teach it to their children. A lot of parents and all, so there was a huge drop, which it started to resurge. But yeah, there was an active policy by the French government in school to shame those who didn't speak true French, which was actually just Parisian French, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest. Um, there's a lot of things. I mean, it's kind of a joke now, but there is definitely a difference between Paris and what they call the provinces,
Mm-hmm.
les provinces, not les provinces, les provinces. Like so. Uh, yeah, I think, but I also think French really enjoy hating the Parisians. It's our national sport.
Well, it's weird because, like, as an American, a lot of the stereotypes of French people were always
Yeah,
Parisian stereotypes because for an American, it's like you go to Paris, you see the Eiffel Tower, you walk along the big boulevards, and then you go home. Maybe go to the Louvre and stand way too
yeah.
far from the Mona Lisa, call it a day.
Uh, to anyone listening, it's not worth it. Don't go to watch the Mona Lisa. Um, it's just it's just not worth it.
It's really small and really
But yeah,
far
yeah, I
away.
agree. It's yeah, and it's full of tourists, and it's actually much smaller than you expect. Uh, it's pretty tiny. I remember going, and I was baffled because just behind there was an enormous painting. I think it's the painting of the sailors that were on a raft. With the guy waving the cloth at the top, which
Mm.
is pretty astonishing. And you see everyone around this tiny painting when there's this huge thing behind. But anyway, yeah, I think it's really sad how people just focus on Paris. And as great as it is, I mean, there's some other awesome places in France. I particularly love Bordeaux. Uh, and it's actually sunny there. So, instead of going to Paris, I recommend anyone to go to Bordeaux instead.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, and people do have the image of Parisians, and I agree that Parisians can be pretty obnoxious,
Well, that's, everyone was like,
especially the
"Oh,
waiters.
don't even try to speak French. They're very rude. They're in a hurry. They're all this." And like, again, my entire experience in Paris was like sitting in the, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say it in the American way, the Charles de Gaulle airport. So I can't really say I've been in
Yeah,
Paris. I've been to the airport, but like we spent a few days in Chamonix, and that was not our experience at all. Like people were super relaxed and laid back and calm and kind, and I even tried to order ice cream in French and made some girl laugh, and she switched to English, bless her heart, but she wasn't like rude about it. She was just like, "Oh, yeah, this dude needs his ice cream. Let's speed this up."
no, I mean, there's also a huge difference between North and South in French, which is, I think, not appreciated a lot. And the South, we're much more Mediterranean and much more laid back. And I mean, one of my fondest memories growing up is having these really long lunches on Sundays, where I would just go into the countryside to my uncle's house, and literally for 5 hours we would eat and drink, and it's just being very lazy and laid back. And that contrasts heavily against Paris, which is everyone rushing around, and you have to have your coffee and you have to get out. And
Hmm.
so yeah, I think more people should go to the south because it's a wonderful place. uh, yeah, yeah, and people will think the French are less obnoxious after that, hopefully.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because when I was in Germany too, it was very close to France. I was in Mayen and Der Eifel, and so actually some of the castles around there, you could go inside the castles, and they had all the portraits of the rulers. And for a lot of
Yeah.
like the 14, 15, 1600s, every couple portraits it would alternate a German name or a French name, but they knew how to slow it down and have some lunches too. We did a dinner party with some of the locals, and man, it was like a 7-course meal, and like late, we started in the afternoon, like late into the evening, but it was very slow and drawn out and relaxed.
I mean, I think it's just great. It's just time to spend with family. I mean, also want to share with my channel is that sort of thing is uh, I'm a big fan of cooking, and I feel like a lot of French food, the food people know instead of ratatouille and maybe bouillabaisse. Uh, like other than that, the only thing people know is really is Parisian food. And I just wanted to share, some more regional stuff, which people would eat as a family, and they would cook together, and it tells a lot about the local history and what they grew up, what they went through, and things like that. And I just hope people discover more about French, other than your typical pretentious, luxurious French restaurant. um, and yeah, and I think part of enjoying that regional food is also taking the time, because a lot of the locals here, meals are a really important part, and I think it deserves its time.
Oh yeah, I can say definitely the best meal I had in France was not the 4 and 5 star restaurants in Chamonix. Those were a little too much for me. We went to and I'm gonna butcher this again. I apologize. An auberge, and I don't even remember the
Yeah.
town's name. It was just middle of the Alps, and this guy and his wife had run it for years, and it was just like meat and potatoes and some type of gravy
Ah,
and wine, and somehow they had just perfected this recipe, and it was amazing. It was like the
ah.
best stew over potatoes I'd ever had.
Do you have a raclette?
We did, I think, in Switzerland. We didn't have it in France, but we had it in Switzerland, and that was really good too.
But did you have the proper one, or did you have one with the square cheeses?
I don't remember what. I mean, they came up with the knife and they did it right over our stuff at the table, but I don't remember what the
Okay.
shape the cheese was in.
Like, okay, there's the raclette machine, which is fun, but the real good one is when you have they basically give you like half of a round of reblochon, and they put this sort of a grill over it, and it melts, and then you scrap it off on the potatoes. That's pretty deadly.
Yeah, they scraped it off at the table, so it wasn't out of a machine,
Okay.
and that was pretty good.
No,
And
it's
same
cool.
thing,
I mean,
simple and nice. I liked that.
yeah, and that's really Savoyard food, and
Hmm.
um, yeah, I think it's a huge part of the identity. I also think a lot of the meat, for example, is not traditional at all. I mean, poor people can afford the meat at all, but which I think people don't realize. But yeah, the cheese and the potato, it's interesting to think also that that's what the poor people used to eat in winter, because they would burn thousands of calories with all the coal and work they had to do. And I I guess culinary history is an underappreciated part of history.
It is just the history of beer and oh man, the history of wine is so contentious because talking about myths, I had a professor who swore to us, this is a professor at a big state university, and she swore that the Greeks and the Romans cut their water with wine because that would help purify the bacteria out of the water. And then I've read recently now people are saying, like, no, like medieval people, like people in any era, they didn't just drink alcohol because their water was
Yeah.
bad. Like they knew how to dig a well. They drank alcohol either for the calories or for fun. And they just,
Okay.
yeah, but it was interesting because that's another one. I got to go do
Yeah.
independent research because the professor swore by that. And I have had people argue that that's not true at all.
Yeah. No, no. I mean, I kind of always assumed that people drank alcohol because their water was bad.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it just fits so well because people have this image of dark ages as they're covered in mud and it's dark and everyone is miserable, but and they haven't showered in 2 years, and I think it's really insulting for them. Um, and it's kind of a condescending look of the past. Like they're not, they're our ancestors. They're not absolute idiots too
Hmm.
either. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. I actually thought that the Romans cut their wine with water too.
That's what I thought, and so there are professors who swear by that, but I've also seen now some people arguing against that. So you can have interesting debates about the role of water in wine, and I don't know the actual answer. I mean, if anyone in the comments thinks they know, I'd be interested to see that. But yeah, that was fascinating. Like when you talk about history that we don't put enough stock in, you can have a debate about the role of water in wine, and that's awesome to
I
me.
think also it goes back to our previous conversation. Is again, Roman history is, at least the West was 800 years. Maybe there was a time where they cut their wine with water, and a time where they didn't, and saying it's like the Gallic mustache I was always saying in my video. Yeah, there was a time where they used to wear the mustache, but it was out of fashion by the time Julius Caesar invaded.
Hmm.
And just saying they wore the mustache is kind of silly. These people, you don't dress the same as your grandfather or your father even,
Hmm.
and so
Yeah, but you can't make an
yeah,
iconic
maybe it's not
cartoon out of that. If you want to,
Asterix and Obelix.
yeah. No, even the bathing thing. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure someone will if I'm not correct. But in the quote unquote dark age, like the early and the middle medieval ages, Europeans were actually really into bathing. It was actually more in like the 14 and 1500s as thoughts about sharing baths, and I've read some theories that it was about sexuality and stuff. I mean, it might have been a cleanliness thing in the post-plague, but that it was more those like 1500s where bathing started falling out of fashion. That you can't say that about earlier times.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I remember reading how, um, for example, the Europeans were pretty shocked by how, when they discovered Americas, how the natives would, how were and how they would baffle, together or naked and things like that. But when thinking about that, it kind of makes me realize how much also of my knowledge just come from things that I've read, and it makes me wonder, like, where did I read that? Is it reliable?
Mm-hmm.
And did I even bother double checking whether it was true? So, but you're reading them. So I do think it was more in the 14th, 15th century. Okay, not for, yeah, where, yeah, just the,
Yeah, but it just, it's just fascinating how that a couple documents showing differences between Native Americans and Europeans and shaving and clothing and laundry and bathing habits, how then that gets backported all the way to like, 476 and oh, Rome fell, they forgot how to bathe. Like they're done. It's amazing.
you see, I always saw Christianity and a lot of the conservative around him as a reaction to Roman extremism. But then if you look into it, Rome wasn't that extreme. Like, for example, um, you kind of have this image of these wild orgies, but actually they were much more pudic. And actually, if you like, being a pervert, for example, was badly seen in society, or
Mm-hmm.
having too much intercourse and things like that. And even though you have this image of them doing these crazy orgies, and so it's just hard to know what's the actual truth, and it has an impact because then for a long time I saw the rise of Christianity as a and all the very, very strict and pudic as a sort of the empire collapsed because it just became too deprived. So to save ourselves, we need to do the inverse. Um, Actually, for example, the Romans thought the Greeks were deprived, and if that's true, my whole kind of hypothesis and conclusion is just has no basis. Uh, yeah,
No, I think you're right because you look talking about how much can we even trust sources all throughout ancient times and even more modern writers. One of the themes that keeps coming up is people trying to ascribe the fall of the civilization to like decadence. Like, oh, you have a very
yeah,
hard and tough people, and then they get complacent and they party too much, and then they fall apart, and someone tougher than them takes over. And it's usually like later writers ascribing that. I always laugh because I'm a teacher and people make fun of me anytime I'm like, oh, these kids today, because as a historian I realize like that's not a new thought. People have been saying kids today since humans could write, and before that they probably passed the tales down orally.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think when books became more common, there was probably the same comments as people reading too much. They don't go outside enough. But it's just, I also find kind of funny how people feel like it's different.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, before the discovery of quantum physics, they thought they had discovered everything they needed to discover in physics. And then they discover quantum physics, and it just opens this new realm. And I guess it's totally irrelevant, but I guess my point is that I hate when people feel morally superior because 100 years ago, what we think is absolutely backwards today is what people thought was at the upfront of moral superiority.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny how everyone at each period feel, because they look back at how superior they are morally and scientifically, they always feel like they're at the top and the edge. And And I guess knowing, I always have to remind myself that in 1,000 years, people are going to look at us like idiots, like we were in the
Hmm.
dark ages.
Oh, and that they
um,
will. It's presentism, and it's really hard not to do. Like I admit I had a presentist moment, and a professor had to check me on it because we were talking about something, and phrenology came up, and I laughed. And she had to remind me. She's like, "Well, if you were in an American or European university in like the late 18 or early 19, you were taught phrenology. How would you know any better?" And I realized, like, oh yeah, they wouldn't. It seems really dumb to us today, but they
yeah,
wouldn't. That was their science. And so even me, like, I had to be checked on that.
in hindsight is just so easy. It's the same thing in finance, which is my field. Is just people always like, hindsight investing. It's so easy, and we can't predict what's going to happen in 100 years. The only thing I can predict is that in 100 years we're going to look like backward idiots.
Hmm.
uh, so I prefer to not feel superior, just in case I end up having the opinion of a backward idiot.
And the truth is, like you say, we probably do. We don't know what dark matter is yet. We just know it has observable effects. But even in a couple hundred years, I'm sure they're going to figure it out, and they're going to think we're morons for just calling it that and saying, well, it causes gravity and we don't know. And they're going to laugh at us.
But even like not even just science, but socially, like on things like, like 200 years ago, for example, um, vote, was, it wasn't part of the morality of back then. Uh, but now, you just look back then and you just look back and like, oh, they were a bunch of sexist idiots. And, but, like, what was moral, and that was their morality spectrums. I'm sure there were a few people who were, uh, well, maybe not, but there were a few people advocating it. But for them, that was the crazy person, and they were the normal one.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure we have our, like, I know we have our
Um,
backwards tendencies. Oh,
just it's just crazy to think that in 200 years they're going to look back at us as some kind of backward dark age
mm-hmm.
person.
But there's always, and that's good historians will always find those humanizing factors. Like I was reading something about Pompeii, and they were looking at graffiti from Pompeii, and a Roman soldier wrote some term, and they were trying to figure out if he was talking about. It was either like going to the bathroom or having sex or something. And it was such a relatable thing. And like when I was doing a Russian history class, they found inside a very, very old Orthodox church, one of the builders had carved basically so and so was here. And it's like we still have people
Yeah.
writing in bathroom stalls and stuff, blank was here. Like, what a universal human thing. And so we can judge
No,
them and say
no.
we're so superior, but like deep down we're not. We're still going to carve I was here or something inappropriate when we get a chance to do graffiti.
No, this is why I love humanizing history and just looking at mundane in quotation, but more day-to-day things, because it gives much more reality, I think, to history. I mean, you look at those dog how do you say uh, tombstones,
Mm-hmm.
more or less of the Roman times, and people saying, literally calling Rex. I think Rex is a Latin name. Literally calling their dog Rex, saying how good of a good dog it was, and that's extremely relatable. Actually, one of my favorite things is, people who colorize old pictures. I feel it's
Mm-hmm.
a great way um, to yeah, to just feel the past, because it might sound silly, but it's kind of easy to forget. It's easy to forget the fact that, yeah, their life wasn't in black and white, despite the cameras and the pictures. They saw colors like we did, and it makes it easier to kind of imagine their to-day life, because in the end they had the same moon, they had the same trees and things like that. And I think it's a great way to be to relate much more to history.
Oh yeah, I had a student ask once. They pulled me aside and they're like, were things, did people not see in color? Were things actually in black and white? And I had to say no, it was just the technology. But we even talk about like buildings from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and how at one point they had paint, they had gold trim, they were vibrant. Like, we think of so much of the ancient time as just white marble or like mud brick or sandstone. And it wasn't. They were these
Yeah.
big,
And
beautiful, vibrant, colorful cities. But we just think,
uh,
oh, it was stone, it was marble.
and that's pretty crazy to imagine that Greek statues were painted, and you can't. And I mean, the whole image comes from Renaissance paintings and statues, which were white marble and painted as white marble because they didn't have the technology to know that there was fragments of paint, which tells us today that they used to be painted.
Mm-hmm.
And it just kind of shifts your whole perspective. I mean, to me, to think about columns painted and a statue of Zeus of white marble painted, it's kind of crazy, a bit tasteless, if you ask me. But it's also a really, you kind of wonder how it looked too. I mean, it must have been great.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I know. And I will say the textbooks are trying to get better about that. Although it makes me mad. The one for Athens has an entire section about, trying to recreate the paint scheme on one of these statues of Athena. And it's really
Mhm.
cool, but at the same time, as a teacher, I know, oh, that's at the end of the chapter. Kids are never going to read that. Like, I know when I was a kid in history class, anything that was in, like, the side or as a caption or
Yeah.
a picture or the end of the book, even though that's usually the primary source stuff, they're like, here's a picture and here's how we're analyzing it. No kid ever reads that.
Yeah.
They look at it, oh boy, half a page I don't have to read, even though that's where the actual history is going on. It's like, no, here's how we're trying to recreate something, but that's just me being a crusty
And
old teacher. I apologize.
and right, I think it's good. It's important. It's just of people's history comes from the painting. They don't read. People don't read that much, especially when they're after school. And a lot of it comes from movies and paintings. But if most of the paintings are Renaissance paintings, which are beautiful but wrong, even most of the drawings, even in the textbook, I remember in school, I spent most of the time looking at the cool drawings, to be honest, not reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I know you're a prof, but that's probably what your students are doing. Sorry.
Oh, I'm well
Uh,
aware sometimes they just look at the pictures, especially when you get to Greece and Rome and you have kids of a certain age. The pictures definitely have their draw.
or
That's
anything that's remotely like a battlefield.
Yeah, they like battle stuff and they like to giggle at anything that's naked. That's where they're
For
at.
sure. But yeah, but it's like the Celtic. If any drawing in a textbook or whatever, or a beautiful statue like the dying goal shows him with a big mustache and long hair that's unkept and feathers on his head. Well, I think that's what people are going to remember. They're not going to remember the little appendix saying, actually, that's not accurate. Blah, blah. So, yeah. Um, so, I think mainstream, there needs to be a stronger effort directly, if especially if we create new art, like a movie. But
Mm-hmm.
since most historical movies are done by Mel Gibson, I don't think that's going to happen. Or Scott Riley.
Yeah, and that's I don't know. Like, I don't want to just become a movie reviewer for my channel, but I've had those thoughts because it is so much of what a regular person will see about history and internalize about history that I think it's really important to be critical of it and to ask questions. And even if a movie uses sources to teach people how to think, well, where are you getting that source? Is it a general? Is it, like the Disney movie Pocahontas? You're really taking a lot of John Smith at face value. Well, he was an adventurer. How did he make money? Selling his
Yeah.
story. Why
Yeah.
would you trust someone who makes money selling their story? If
Yeah.
my if
Yeah.
my
And
cash is coming from a book deal, obviously I'm gonna play it up. Why wouldn't I?
yeah,
I sell a better story, I get more money.
it's kind of crazy because, for example, people's depiction of Victorian England is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also crazy that people take his depiction as face value. Like without knowing, for example, uh, what was his political leanings and things like that. But I think Oliver Twist, since is being published, um and like I don't know anything about Victorian English, but I just feel like it's um, people's image of Victorian English is going to 100% mostly come from Oliver Twist because it's something they read, I think, in English school, in high school. There's been a few movies about it, and it just makes you wonder how accurate his depiction. Like, did he also have uh, say some reason to depict it in a certain way more than other?
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the end, like, since we love history, it's easy to kind of assume people care. But sadly, I don't think that many people actually care.
No, they're gonna watch a thing or read a thing in high school, and that's gonna be that.
If the image of a lot of history is just remembering dates,
Mm-hmm.
uh, depressing really quickly.
See, and the funny, I had notes, but when you get people who are fans of history just like talking, you just see what comes out. But that was also kind of the point of this is I just wanted to see, if you get a round table, like where's the conversation going to go?
Yeah, yeah. No, no. I mean, I feel like it's a bit unnatural when there's these people who have scripts and they just have to like just want to hold to it, and they'll completely break the flow of the conversation just because they have to ask these questions or they have to
Yeah.
tick these boxes.
And I wanted it to
And
be very naturalized. I wasn't going to be like, what's the one thing about France every American needs to know? Because I didn't think that would feel natural. But in the end, we talked about a lot of cool stuff with like regionalism and nation building and things like that.
yeah, which somewhat related to France. No, no, I
Mm-hmm.
think it was cool, and I just think it's also clear to uh, maybe remind the listeners to not. I was gonna say face value, but that's not accurate. More like it's just two history lovers talking in the end.
Yeah.
PhD professors.
Well, and he's not a historian. And I've had people get mad at me for saying that. But one of the things I like about Dan Carlin and his podcast is he doesn't pretend he is. Like, I know he shows up on Bad History from time to time on the subreddit there, but he does always up front say he's a fan of history, not a historian. And when he goes off the rails and gives some theory about, like, why a people will rise or fall as a civilization, he'll tell you, oh, I'm
Yeah,
about to say what I'm about to say because I'm not a professor. And, like, he's very upfront, and I think it's awesome. And I think it's worth listening to. I might not cite it in a paper, but it makes me think about history in a certain way, and I think it's valuable for what it is.
yeah, and I think it's just important the fact that makes he democratizes history in that way because he makes it. He reaches out to a different uh, audience to what your average academic would do. So I think it's good. And but you go on threads like our history or our bad history, are the sort of people who are very nitpicky about the things. I think a bit not elitist, but like,
Mm-hmm.
um, they just want to preserve the sanctity of history.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I think there's room for both.
even though,
Like, I've done posts on Ask Historians But even doing a small post on Ask Historians, and I don't know if I'm going to put this in the. I'm still recording, but I don't know if it'll put it in there. It's stressful, and I'll have 3 books on my
Yeah.
lap as I'm writing like a 4-paragraph thing on Reddit, and that almost sounds insane to me. Like I'm just answering a dude's question online, and yet I'm blowing the dust off my archives so I can make sure I'm speaking with 100% authority. Whereas some places you could be like, oh, here's the best answer I could come up with. Look into the sources on your own.
Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely agree. Like every time I post on YouTube, my panic is, my biggest fear is always to get a comment basically calling me out for how full of shit I am. Sorry for
Mm-hmm.
pardon my French for being French. Just saying, imply that you did it on purpose and that you're nefarious and you have bad intent, like you just want to propagate some bad things, or especially if you have a YouTube video, because they can think the incentive is to make some views. A lot of time it's just people assume that you're being evil basically, and that
Mm-hmm.
you had this wrong on purpose just because you want to stain a certain image, you want to propagate a certain image, um, and that's what makes me anxious.
Yeah, well, then some advice: don't talk about World War II and don't talk about the Eastern Front, because I did a video on why the
Yeah.
Soviet Union took such high casualties, and I purged a couple of those comments, but oh my god, I had someone literally post that like the video is irrelevant because Hitler should have won and the world would have been better. I had that one. And then
I got one of my yeah.
I was just gonna say, but I've had people on the other side say,
Okay.
how dare you call Stalin paranoid? He was right, and every person he purged deserved it. And I was like, wow, we've really gone far the other way, huh?
Yeah, that's why I don't get people who do alternative history. I would be super stressed because if you're going to do, what would happen if Stalin has never controlled the USSR, or if the USSR never went socialist? You have people would have complete, for some it would have been, Russia would be this awesome place, and for others it would have been the serfdom under the Tsar. um, you're literally making things up at this point, and I don't know how they don't get more hate, and I don't know how they don't freak out more, because I would freak out.
Yeah, people do that with the American Civil War, and you can imagine if it's a Southerner saying, "Here's what would happen if the South won." It's often
Yeah.
in a rather positive light.
And that's something actually we didn't talk about much, is a shame. Maybe we should keep it for next podcast, is again the idea of impact. People kind of overestimate the impact of single people, or the impact of a certain battle of war, when really I think it's the whole factors which in the long run have a much bigger impact.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was saying, it's the whole idea of would you go and kill Hitler in the past, which just assumes that no Hitler like would have risen during those strenuous time in Germany, when when the same thing happened in Russia, Japan, Italy, uh, a lot of South American states, So um, yeah, it's just putting too much power and strength on, too much importance on single characteristics, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it really makes history deterministic. Because I like that word. um, like, oh, because this and this happened, we ended up here, and so if this is, and it's like kind of like the butterfly effect, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can always, well, could his World War II have been prevented if the Treaty of Versailles didn't happen? And then you can go, oh, could the Treaty of Versailles, well, if the USA hadn't joined World War One, then the Treaty of Versailles would have been more equal, because there wouldn't have been a balance. And you can just go back and back and back until probably the beginning of history.
And it's so weird because all you have to do, talking about scrutinizing sources, is look at what people back then thought, because they didn't think so. Like with the American Civil War, it's easy to say, well, the North had more people, the North had more industry, the North had more railroads. They were always going to win. And Abraham Lincoln in 1864, he won by a big electoral margin. So obviously it was never in question. But like, I was reading Edward Ayer's Thin Light of Freedom, and he uses a lot of newspaper sources from before the election. They didn't think it was decided. They didn't think that Lincoln was going to win for sure. They didn't think the war would continue for sure. There were a lot of people either fearing or rooting for Lincoln losing and then the war settling with a peace that allowed the South to exist. Like, for them, that was very real and very possible. And we know the outcome, so it's easy for us to say, like, no, he was always going to win, it's fine. But then we're literally silencing the people back then because they disagreed. It looked different in their eyes. And that's like what you say. After the Treaty of Versailles, if you ask a German, even if there's no Hitler, like, hey, how's that hyperinflation going? Are you happy? Like, they're probably still going to say no.
No, it just I mean, I think in a prone environment for the rise of such people, to be honest. And so it's just really not a stretch, though, to say that someone like Hitler would have risen. It's just pointless to target just on Hitler. But I guess it kind of contradicts to your point, because if Abraham Lincoln didn't win the second time, it's very possible that the North would have just made peace with the South. And so in that case, it would have got a huge impact. So yeah, I guess it's feeling like I'm contradicting my own theory.
But it's really complicated because, like you say, we know there were a lot of things going on, and it wasn't just that one election. But at the same time, people back then weren't so sure, and there was a lot of things playing into it. And with battles, like, I definitely agree. People argue, well, was Gettysburg the turning point of the Civil War? Was Antietam the turning point of the Civil War? It's like, how do you ever answer that? I don't think there can be an answer.
I think the truth is just it's possible to know, because in that case it just becomes fiction, because it's not what happened. There's only one. It's easy to speculate, but I think the problem also is that every time people say that, again going back to Hitler, it just always assumes it's a on or off. Like, if there was no Hitler, then there was no dictator. If there was no Gettysburg, then the South would have lost maybe a week later in another great battle, You can't know that these other things that would have happened in replacement, basically.
Yeah.
The assumption is always, had there been no Gettysburg, then the South would have won they wouldn't have been a turning point, when they could have very well been another battle later on to replace Gettysburg. And yeah, and I think the same thing is, like, a lot of people praise Napoleon for defending France, and and also doing things like he invented, like, the baccalaureate, which is like our APs, I guess. Massively restabilize the country, through a sort of chaos. But I think it also kind of assumes that that there was only Napoleon that could have done that, when I think, there could have possibly been another coming up that could have done similar good things without trying to invade Russia, for example. So, it just, I think, again, it's just putting too much importance on one single event and assuming, had that not happened, then all the other stuff wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the History Roundtable Podcast, Episode 2. It was a lot of fun having This is Barris on. If you guys enjoy, please like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to go check out his channel. I'm going to put a link in the description and up here because he does awesome content, and we hope to have him on in the future. As always, stay excited about history.